Hello and welcome again to the EOC Podcast, Emergency Operations Conversations. I am your host, Jeff Perkins, and I'm extremely happy to have you with me again here on episode number 3 of the EOC Podcast. This is also going to be episode number 1, where you get to see my face on video, a face that was definitely made for radio. This edition of the video technology is going to make it a lot easier for us to host guests and be able to have them come on seamlessly and be able to share their stories. And maybe, just maybe, one of those guests will be you. I hope it is. If you want to join the EOC podcast and join the conversation, I encourage you to reach out to me on any of the social media platforms, many of which you probably heard about this podcast on. Whatever you do, just reach out and I would be more than happy to have you join me on the podcast, and you can share whatever the heck you want. And I will come up with some really good questions to ask. And I'm definitely encouraged by the feedback I've gotten so far from a lot of different people across the spectrum of not only emergency management, but emergency response, pilots, drone pilots, all kinds of different things. So if you do any sort of emergency work or even like emergency work or want to go to school for emergency work, I can find a place for you on this podcast. If you're interested, like I said, hit me up and I'd love to have you on. So with the midway point of the month of December coming up, the weather outside is definitely feeling a little cold and it's looking a little frightful. So I wanted to have a episode today that was about something a little bit warmer. And what's warmer in the field of emergency service and emergency operations than wildfire, and especially following a 2024 wildfire season that broke so many records. So I would definitely like to engage in that conversation. And we can always pick this conversation up because it is not going to end after today's episode. So if you work in the field of wildland firefighting or support that kind of work, I'm absolutely interested in having you on and would love to have you on and share your stories. And I think that it would definitely benefit our listeners as well. So that being said, today I am dedicating this episode to those men and women who stand on the front lines of one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and that is wildland firefighting. So first and foremost, if you are a wildland firefighter, thank you for what you do. I cannot thank you enough. And this last year was really not only a record-breaking year, but it was a year that opened up a lot of people's eyes. And when it comes to wildland firefighting, there's a few different kinds of wildland firefighter. There are your publicly employed government firefighters. There's some that come in on a conflagration, like they're a structure firefighter that works around the state, and they come in and they do structure protection in the wildland urban interface. And then there's your private wildland firefighters and contractors and whatnot that work out there. And they make up a very large amount of the population of wildland firefighters, and they don't necessarily get the same benefits as your publicly employed wildland firefighters. So specifically today, I'd like to dedicate this episode to the Wildland Firefighter Foundation. Now, the Wildland Firefighter Foundation is an incredible organization that supports firefighters from any employment and their families during times of needs. We'll dive into their mission and what exactly they do, and I'll also provide some contact information and information on how you can get involved with the organization and donate and everything else. I'll leave all of that in the bio of this episode and make sure that you guys have the information in case you would like to support this organization. I support this organization. I have heard many stories from people who were recipients of the benefits of this organization. So if you want to support this as well, I strongly encourage you to do so. It definitely goes to good work. Like I said, I'll be providing more information on that. Today we'll also reflect on this historic 2024 wildfire season, a year that, us in the Pacific Northwest, especially here in Oregon, will not soon forget. This season was the worst on record for Oregon, with nearly 1.9 million acres burned, 17 conflagrations, and an unknown number of emergency declarations. So we'll explore some of those lessons learned, But before we get kicked off, I want to take a moment to honor a man by the name of James Bailey Maxwell. James Bailey Maxwell was a 74-year-old pilot who tragically lost his life during the Falls Fire in Oregon. He was a pilot in operation of a seat or a single engine air tanker, and he unfortunately perished in a crash on that Falls wildfire in Oregon. His legacy, along with the bravery of those who responded this season, deserves our deepest respect and gratitude. So, that all being said, let's get started and let's talk about the scale of the 2024 wildfires. So, I want to begin with the scale. What we're dealing with in 2024 is what I want to say the new normal, because it's been too many times where people have said Oregon has had a record-breaking fire season. Every year now, it seems like, or maybe every other year, at least every few years, the record gets broken. And then it gets broken again, and then it gets broken again. So this is the new normal. 2024 was just an additional number of acres burned and number of conflagrations, but that number continues to go up. So some numbers here to look at, right? Nearly 1.9 million acres burned. That's almost 2 million acres burned. Think about that for a second. That is almost triple the state of Oregon's 10-year average of 642,000 acres. That is insane. So this year brought 17 conflagrations. And for those that don't know, conflagrations are when the governor declares the Conflagration Act. And that allows for different structure firefighters from around the state of Oregon. And I think a lot of other states other than Oregon do this too, but I can only speak intelligently about Oregon. But what that does is that allows for structure firefighters to come into an incident. The Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office incident management teams, which there's 3 of in the state of Oregon, they will go in with whoever's in charge of that incident, whether it's a federal team or maybe a state Oregon Department of Forestry team, or whoever's in charge of the incident. The incident management team from the State Fire Marshal's Office will come in and join that team and establish unified command. And so they will join forces with that already established team that's on the ground, and then bring in different resources to bear to support structural protection for that wildland urban interface. So if there's any structures, businesses, houses, what have you, in that area, they get to provide that direct protection. So that's what a conflagration is. And there was 17 of them in Oregon this year, and that was the most ever recorded. There was 27 immediate response deployments, which are kind of pre-staged assets that are purposely placed throughout the state where there may be a fire nearby based on different statistics. So there was 27 of those deployments. Some of the largest fires in Oregon this year were the Battle Mountain Complex, which burned over 183,000 acres. The Rail Ridge Fire, which consumed about 170,000 acres. Entire communities were at risk, with over 17,000 homes and structures threatened, and 132 structures ultimately lost. So this wildfire season, tested every aspect of Oregon's emergency response infrastructure, every aspect of it, doesn't matter what. It also reinforced how critical it is to continue building resilience and improving our own coordination efforts. Now, when it comes to building resilience, that simply means we have to invest ahead of time, so before wildfire season, in making sure that people know how to take care of themselves. So when this disaster strikes, we want to make sure that people can take care of themselves. They know how to create defensible space. They know when it's time to go. So even if they don't get a notification that they need to evacuate, if they know that, like, hey, things are getting pretty bad here, let me go to a friend's house or a relative's house outside of this area because I know where the fire's going. I know I'm looking at the different resources that are available, and I'm making the decision ahead of time to get myself and my family out of harm's way. That's having a plan. That's, implementing that plan and just being aware of the risks that are associated with where people are. So building that resilience is a significant way that we can create a more resilient and self-sustaining population in that wildland urban interface. And it makes the job of, the Oregon Department of Forestry, the federal government, the state government, it makes that job a lot easier because they already have a population that's prepared and ready. Now, the impacts of this wildfire season were felt not just by those in those affected communities, but also by all the responders who put their lives on the line to protect those communities. So I'm going to shift the discussion to the challenges of those particular response efforts. Now, those challenges are many, right? Because responding to a wildfire season of this magnitude required an incredible amount of coordination as well as resources of all kinds. Agencies leaned heavily on the Oregon Fire Mutual Aid System to address resource shortages, and pre-positioned resources played a massive role in saving lives and minimizing damage. Those pre-positioned assets that I kind of talked about before. However, the operational tempo this season was relentless. No other way to say it other than that. Sustained deployment stretched resources and personnel to their absolute limits. And that was compounded by a heavy reliance on the seasonal workforce grants. So the communication and coordination among local, state, and federal agencies, they were vital, but it also exposed a lot of areas where there is an absolute need for improvement. And then also the grants that I mentioned, that also presents an opportunity to look at and say, okay, we know these are going to happen, right? I started the episode by saying this is the new normal. This is no longer a no notice event. If it gets warm and you're in Oregon, you best believe that it's going to burn. Things are going to burn. So this is not a no notice event. We know that fire is coming. We know it's going to happen. There is going to be fire on the landscape every single year. However, Oregon does not fund these wildfire efforts just right now. So today is the 13th of December. It's a Friday. This week, the legislature was actually meeting in an emergency session to be able to pay the contractors who helped fight the fire during this historic fire season. That's absurd. That's absolutely absurd. Again, I'm going to say this until I'm blue in the face. Wildfire is not a no-notice event. It is not. We know it's coming. So the fact that as a state legislature, we don't fund the ability to fight these, I want to say historic, but again, it's not historic because every year is breaking a new record, right? History is made every single fire season. So if I was to say, oh, it's only during the historic ones, that's every year now. That's every single year now. And there's a lot of discussion about why it's every year. There's all kinds of stuff. And I'm not going to get into that because I think that's a different podcast. However, I will say the legislature needs to use this upcoming long session to fund this effort of fighting wildfire properly. This historic season that we just went through is actually beneficial. It can be beneficial. Yes, it was hard. Yes, people perished. There was people injured. Millions of acres were burned. However, that already happened. And we can just say that happened and do nothing from that or learn nothing from that. Or we can say that happened and we're going to make sure that we use that as the vital lesson that it is and make sure that things are funded properly. So the 2024 wildfire season cost Oregon $317.5 million. That's the highest on record. And this raises critical questions about how we ensure that funding stability in the face of these growing threats. Because I'm going to say again, this is not a no-notice event. Wildfire is not a no-notice event. We know it's coming. We have to fund it. And again, this was the new record, but the new record is the new normal. That is the new normal. And it was tragic. And we can learn lessons and make ourselves more prepared. Like I said earlier, strengthening our communities, educating our communities, investing in our communities to make them more resilient. Now, that is a way that we can honor the weddings missed, the birthdays missed, the nights and nights and nights and nights and days away from home that a lot of these people did. And also honor the memory of those who don't come back. And on that note, I want to honor James Bailey Maxwell. I want to honor this person who made the ultimate sacrifice this wildfire season. James Bailey Maxwell was a 74-year-old pilot who tragically lost his life during the Falls Fire. Mr. Maxwell had a remarkable career, flying professionally for over 5 decades and logging approximately 24,000 flight hours. He was an extremely experienced and respected pilot, and he dedicated his life to serving others. On July 25th, 2024, while assisting with suppression efforts on the Falls Fire, Mr. Maxwell's single-engine air tanker, or SEAT, crashed under difficult circumstances. Although the investigation is still ongoing, it's believed that adverse weather conditions played a role in the crash of the aircraft. Now, his passing is a profound loss to the firefighting and aviation community, and I want to express my deepest condolences to his family, to his friends, to his colleagues, anyone that works in wildland firefighting, whether you're in aviation or any other part, your colleagues are your family. And I have a personal tie to this particular incident because I was also on the Falls Fire when the plane went down. And that gave me a firsthand understanding of how critical these aerial firefighting apparatus are to the efforts. As part of the communications team, I witnessed the precision and bravery of pilots like Mr. Maxwell, and they risk everything to protect these communities. And I want to close this part of the episode by saying that his dedication and his sacrifice will never be forgotten by me, and I'm sure many, many others as well. But before we move on, I'd like to highlight that organization that I was talking about before, the Wildland Firefighter Foundation. And that particular organization has been instrumental in supporting the firefighting community. Their mission is to assist families and injured firefighters or the families of killed firefighters that were killed in the line of duty. And they provide resources to those people, the firefighters or their families. And these people, they dedicate their lives to this profession, to protecting our lands, to protecting our forests. And if you live in the Northwest, you know that there is a timber industry that thrives but is also threatened, right? So a lot of these areas where logging happens and we're able to harvest timber, that's private land, right? That is what sustains our state. That's what helps keep people employed. And if all that land burns up, then there is no work, right? There's no logging if there's no trees. And there's no trees if they're all burnt to a crisp. So these people dedicate their lives to protecting other people's livelihoods and the places that we get to go and enjoy, where we get to go be one with nature. So they dedicate themselves to that. And this foundation dedicates itself to offering financial assistance, counseling, and advocacy for the firefighters and their families. And they do it not just to the government firefighters, they do it to the private firefighters as well. They provide all of this to anyone, regardless of the employer. And for that, I applaud the Wildland Firefighter Foundation. Again, if you'd like to learn more on how you can support their work or how you can donate, I ask that you visit wffoundation.org, wffoundation.org, or you can call them at area code 208-336-2996. Again, wffoundation.org. And I'll also provide all of this information in the bio of this episode. So you can find it on wherever you're listening to this episode or now watching, since we're on video. You should be able to follow a link to where you can learn more about the organization. And again, I support that organization, and I strongly suggest that you too. And organizations like this remind us that we're all part of a much broader community. No matter what part of emergency service that we work in, we are united by a shared commitment to resilience and care for one another. So again, wffoundation.org. All right, so we're going to kind of shift in a little bit different direction now. So we're going to talk about kind of some of the ways that 2024 wildfire season went right and went wrong. Where can we learn? What were the lessons that we learned during this 2024 historic wildfire season? So there were several lessons that stand out to me. First, the pre-positioning of resources made a significant difference in the response times. Second, enhanced public warning systems saved lives by enabling more efficient evacuation. So having the assets pre-positioned in places that we assume fire's going to happen worked. That worked great. We had resources ready to deploy to fires when they were burning nearby. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you we have people who know where and when fires are most likely going to happen, because we're able to put resources in an area where they have a short response time. Again, wildfire is not a no-notice event. The other thing, enhanced public warning systems saved lives by enabling more efficient evacuations. Now, I wrote that down because that's a very, very close to my heart topic, because in the Office of Statewide Interoperability, we oversee the state's contract of alert and warning called ORAlert. And so I see this as a huge success. But what was happened in addition to that was the ability for evacuation mapping. So if you have a county that has an alert and warning system, great. They have a way that they can reach out to their county and say, hey, you need to go. Some of these counties are huge, especially the ones where wildfire happens. These counties are massive. So if you're 200 miles away from the fire, you don't want to get an evacuation notice. So these maps and everything else, and these extra additions to that alert and warning software and technology is huge, and it's only getting better. And so I think that this year, as we rolled that out, and as counties and even at the state level started using this technology, I think it definitely proved its usefulness. Now, lessons learned, right, are not always great lessons. There was gaps in the predictive modeling. That meant resources weren't always allocated effectively. So there was some that were brought in from out of state, which is extremely expensive and maybe not placed in the best area. And while interagency collaboration was strong, it highlighted areas where communication and coordination has to improve. These lessons aren't just like technical related, but they're about ensuring the safety of both the first responders and the communities that they're heading out to protect. So the 2024 wildfire season, I think, underscored the importance of proactive forest management. Now, those out there, I know that is a sensitive topic, so please do not burn my house down for this. Please, no pun intended with the fire thing. But we have to manage our forests. We have to do, more harvesting if we can, thinning, doing prescribed burns. All these things help a forest stay healthy, and it removes the fuel that starts these wildfires. Or, the fuel may not start it. A lightning strike may start it, but if there's a ton of fuel on the ground, then of course it's going to grow. It's going to be big. But if a lightning strikes and there's no fuel, it's just a lightning strike. That's it. It doesn't equate to a wildland fire. Now, you can't do everything. You can't prescribe burn everywhere. You can't cut everything. You'll never 100% reduce the risk of wildfire. However, we have to do better. We have to do better. We have to remove these hazardous fuels that directly contribute to the frequency and intensity of these more catastrophic wildfires. The proof is in the pudding, right? We've seen it. We've gone through it enough times to know that mismanaged forests burn worse. And in the state of Oregon, and if you look at the maps of where these fires burned this year, many of them started on federal land. So the federal government land, either the national forest, national grassland, whatever the federal land is called, that's where a lot of these fires started. So I think we have to work more closely with our federal partners to be able to do some fuel reduction and some other things. Now, when I talk about fuel, I'm very familiar with that term because I work a lot in wildland fires. So a lot of people might not know what I mean by fuel. Fuel is like the stuff on the ground that falls and then piles up and then dries out and burns really fast, really, really fast. So some people call it duff on the ground. So there's ground fuels, and that spreads to ladder fuels, which are fuels that as like a ladder kind of would illustrate, climbs up the tree towards the canopy. And so reducing those fuels reduces the likelihood of these fires being so catastrophic, right? And so we need to be able to work together, not only at the state level, but with our federal partners to reduce those fuels. It will really, really, really help the efforts that we make if we can get our federal partners on board. And that's because a lot of acres in this state are federally owned. And the more acres you own in this state, especially when it's wildland environment, the more likely it is that you are going to have a fire on your property. And it can't be all up to the state to have to put out a lot of fires that burn. Maybe it starts in federal land, but then burns into state land or private land. If there was fuels reduction done in those areas that we know a fire might start, then we can really reduce not only the fires themselves, but we can also reduce the strain that's placed on the much smaller state government, which doesn't have their funding figured out yet. And the federal government can make those efforts, which will really help the state partners and the private companies that work to put these fires out and work to try to manage their lands, because they make money off their lands. That is their livelihood, right? So if we can get the private industry, the state government, the federal government all working together, communicating, collaborating, that's how I see that issue being resolved. But everyone has to have a seat at the table, and everyone has to want to sit down, right? And I don't see that happening right now. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. I got to try to also make this because I want this podcast to be something that's not just Oregon centric. Again, I'm just sharing my Oregon experiences here early on in the series because that's all I have. So I'm going to shameless plug here. Anyone that wants to be on this podcast, please reach out, especially if you're not from Oregon. I want to get your experience. I want to see what it's like in emergency management and emergency service all over the country and even the world. So if you're listening to this in another country, I implore you, reach out. I would love to hear your experience selfishly because I want to hear about it. And then I also want to share it with anyone that wants to listen. But I want to go up north a little bit to Washington. Sorry, California. You guys do your own thing. I'd love to hear from somebody in Cal Fire or anybody else that wants to share their experience about wildland fire because they kind of write the book on the thing. But I'm sorry, California, I'm going to leave you out of this episode today. We're going to talk a little bit about Washington. And when I say a little, we are strapped for time. So I am going to keep it short and sweet. But we're going to kind of look over at Washington and see how they tackled their wildfire challenges in 2024. And here in Oregon, we faced our worst on record. And Washington dealt with a series of significant fires that demanded similar levels of coordination and resource allocation. And I like to bring up Washington because Washington and Oregon collaborate extremely well. And Washington didn't really have the fire season that Oregon had, and they didn't have their worst fire season on record this year. That's not saying that they didn't have a significant fire season. I think that they did, but they offered a tremendous amount of help to Oregon when they noticed that their neighbor to the south was struggling. And so, Washington and Oregon, the collaboration during these crises, that really highlights the importance of these partnerships, and sharing resources, intelligence, personnel. When you cross those across the state lines, and it just allows not only the state receiving that, but the other state as well to respond better. Because if you're having a quiet fire season, now I said the Q word, my apologies for anybody that's at work right now and the phone hasn't rang or the pager hasn't gone off, my bad. If you're having a less than loud or busy fire season, you have firefighters or other wildland fire support folks that need to get training, need to get that experience. When you have that close relationship with another state where you can send those folks down to deploy, as like mutual aid or EMAC, that keeps that bench well trained and ready to go when something happens in your state. So that keeps that knowledge right there, right in the front of the brain, right? They're able to, next fire season, when something happens, they're able to immediately respond. They've got all the training, experience, and knowledge they need to be able to help out. And then what it does is it also creates a partnership and a friendship that they have with that other state. And so when that bad day happens in that other state that received the help is going to remember that. And they're going to say, hey, our neighbor is having a problem and we're going to go help them out. And Washington and Oregon have really done that well. I want to shout out Washington. I want to say it's the times that I've worked with Washington responders and EOC staff and other things like that. It has been an absolute privilege. It's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot, and I've been able to share a lot of what I know with those Washington people. And I just want to say that it is great. And I think that, these partnerships underscore the need for continued investment in regional interoperability. And again, I'm a comms nerd, but I mean that both in communications and operational strategy. The more seamlessly that we can work across borders and say that okay, just because you're on one side of the river doesn't mean that we don't have a similar interest or a common interest here. We will be better equipped to handle future crises on either side of those borders. Now, building resilience is important. Like I said earlier, we want to make sure that we invest in our communities and we invest in them to be able to support themselves. we shouldn't have to come in and say, hey, everybody, the government's here. We're here to help, right? Everyone knows that that is never well accepted. And if we can have people in communities lift themselves up and be prepared, that's great. But it's on us to be able to provide that knowledge and actually a little bit of investment, because people are struggling. They can't afford groceries day to day, let alone having a bunch of groceries that they have to hold on to and not eat in case something bad happens, right? So as we look ahead, we need to require a multifaceted resilience approach. And that starts at the highest level. When we're making policy changes, we need to think about that. Funding, is it sustainable? Are there new innovative technologies like AI or drones that can play a role? Community engagement, how do we reach out there? Again, wildfires are becoming more frequent and severe, and the more that we empower individuals, neighborhoods, communities to look after themselves, the stronger our collective response will be. And we need to consider the role of education too. We need to start putting resilience education programs into schools. Kids need to learn about this from an early age. We teach about earthquake preparedness and all kinds of stuff in the Northwest at the school level. I can go talk to my 13-year-old and she'll immediately tell me, oh yeah, this is how we do this. This is what an earthquake is. This is what the Cascadia subduction zone is. She knows all about it, but they don't teach about wildfire. And I really think that, in those areas, we need to incorporate that into schools. If you work for a school and you're in a rural area and you teach about wildfire, I want to know about it. I want to hear about it. I want to share your story. What are you doing to teach the next generation how to be safe in a wildfire? And I know that there's some education programs out there, but again, it's only who we can touch, right? We need to go to where people are, not have them come to us to distribute educational information. We need to teach homeowners about defensible space. And that is a hot topic, I know, but we need to teach them about it and how to protect their property, how to prepare local responders like your rural fire protection districts for wildfire scenarios. We need to educate these policymakers on the realities of this new normal, on the realities that when you're thinking of funding and passing a funding package at the legislative level, those elected officials need to know this is not a no-notice event. This is the new normal. We are breaking records every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. We are breaking records. We are not breaking records with the least amount. We are always breaking records with the most amount of resources deployed, the most amount of money spent, the most amount of acres burned, the most amount of board feet burned and lost, economic losses. So we need to keep going. We need to keep pushing on and letting these folks know that a well-funded wildfire preparedness package will have a lasting impact, because wildfire is not a no-notice event. Now I'm going to close out here. I am running out of time. The 2024 wildfire season was a reminder of the challenges that we face here in the Northwest, but it showed the incredible strength and dedication of our emergency responders and communities. I encourage you to reflect how you can to contribute to wildfire preparedness in your own life, whether that's creating a family plan, evacuation plan, supporting your local fire districts, or donating to organizations like the Wildland Firefighter Foundation. Every effort makes a difference. So thank you very much for tuning into the EOC podcast. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe, please leave a review, and share it with your network. Share away. The more people we can get to listen, the better we'll be. I thank you again, and I'll see you on the next one. Keep building those bridges.